Hi folks, welcome back to Psychology 1200, continuing on with the topic of personality. And we're going to devote this lecture to some really what I think are more or less just stories about what human personality is all about and what drives humans' development and what determines whether a person is successful and effective human being or whether they suffer a lot of maladaptive behaviors and emotions and mental disorders. These are stories because there's no real scientific evidence to favor any of them. And, so why talk about them? And that's a very good question, listener. Why talk about things that have no basis in scientific evidence? The reason is because for historical reasons, psychology has been influenced quite powerfully by these different ways of thinking about personality that I'm about to discuss with my colleague Lana. Psychology has been hugely influenced by these ideas, but not only psychology, a wide range of fields have been influenced by these theories of personality. So economics, reasoning about sociology, art, literature, a lot of different areas outside of psychology have been heavily influenced by the theories of personality that I'm about to discuss. And I'm going to start with perhaps one of the most famous, maybe the most famous psychologist who ever lived, Dr. Sigmund Freud. Dr. Sigmund Freud founded psychodynamic theory end of the 1800s, early 1900s. And he had this idea, he had some pretty specific ideas about what the nature of human personality was and what kind of stuff we were all constructed of. He distinguished between conscious influences on a person and what a person's consciously aware of, and all of the kind of mental processes that are occurring below the level of consciousness. So he literally said that what a person's aware of, what they're conscious of, is really just the tip of the iceberg. That most of what's going on in the human psyche, the human mind, is going on outside of our awareness. And that happens to be true, although the way he structured things may or may not be true. But unconscious influences definitely are important, as you might have gathered from the other things we've discussed in this class. So here's the tip of the iceberg. This is your contact with the outside world as far as awareness goes. And then, according to Freud, it's our ego that has some awareness of what's going on out there. And then some amount of what our ego is doing is processing things also below the level of consciousness. What is the ego? The ego is the thing that's the negotiator. It negotiates with the demands of the society we're in and our own demands to seek pleasurable experiences. Okay, so according to Freud, the superego is the part of our structure of our personality that controls represents society wanting to control us and make sure that we behave in socially appropriate ways. And this other component, the id, operates by what's called the pleasure principle. And it's the part of our personality that wants to seek pleasurable experiences at all costs and doesn't particularly care about what society's rules are. Okay, so you can think about going deeper down this iceberg. You have pre-conscious processes, which is material just below the surface of awareness but can be brought into awareness quite easily. And then this whole under the water part of the iceberg, big chunk, that's the unconscious, which is information that we have inside us that is difficult to bring into conscious awareness, way deep down, but that nonetheless has big effects on how we behave from one moment to the next. Okay, so this is the basic idea that our mind is full of psychological or intrapsychic forces that motivate people's actions, our actions, and many of these are ones that we're not consciously aware of. And these intrapsychic forces, they originate from early childhood, so we actually don't even remember the events that might have led to these unconscious conflicts that exist within us and that cause us to behave in one way or another. But it's this energy that we've acquired from experiences in childhood, conflicts that have been built in us since childhood that lie in our unconscious, that because we're not consciously aware of them, they have to have an outlet somehow. So we're protected somewhat from maybe quite painful events that occurred in childhood, but they have to have an outlet in some way. And the way they get their outlet is they encourage us to engage in maladaptive adult behaviors if they're quite negative events of childhood. But if we have mainly just happy, healthy events during childhood, then that will result in more healthy behaviors. So that any maladaptive adult behavior, you drink too much, you're too violent, you're depressed, they stem from these intrapsychic forces that are below the level of awareness and that might have been established very early in childhood.
So according to Freud, we do have these three components of personality: the id, ego, and superego. So we're going to start with the id, or this is the selfish you, and this is present at birth. Now it's completely unconscious, excuse me, and it's unconscious motives that are aimed at avoiding pain and obtaining pleasure. Now these include the life instinct and the death instinct. So the life instinct is involved in our drive for sexual pleasure, and it's also called libido. And the death instinct is involved in our drive towards aggression. So everything we do boils down to either sex or violence, according to Freud.
That's right. That's all that humans care about deep down, sex or violence, according to Freud. Well, the other component of personality, the second one, is called the ego. This is the negotiator, and its role is to seek a compromise between the constraints that society imposes on our behavior. We might want a lot of things, but we can only get away with certain things because there's rules. There's parents imposing rules, a broader society is controlling us and trying to discourage us from engaging in just whatever we want to do. It might feel great to hit somebody. Society doesn't permit it. So we somehow have to strike a balance between the rules that society has and these lustful urges of the id. The id wants to express all kinds of things that we're not allowed to express, sexual urges and violent urges. And so in order to strike this compromise, the ego tries to figure out appropriate outlets for these sexual and aggressive urges that don't violate the rules of the society. So that's quite a sticky situation for the ego to be involved with.
Well, the superego is this third component of personality, and it's your conscience, or the mental representation of the man. So some of you might notice the Pinocchio reference here. So it's the talking cricket in Pinocchio. Now, the superego knows all of the rules that your society and your parents impose. And it knows the consequences of behavior, so all the possible different punishments. And it's going to deal out pride if you've been good, and it's going to deal out guilt and shame if you've been bad. Okay, so it's the best part of you. If you picture a little devil and angel on your shoulders, the devil would be the id, and the little angel would be the superego.
It's not a bad system, maybe. Sort of a balance the ego's trying to strike between what you want and what society will let you get away with. But there can be an imbalance that arises in some people between these two competing aspects of personality. You could have the id having too much control in the negotiation that the ego is trying to strike. So that people with the id that's in too much control of their behavior will be more uncontrolled, will be quite impulsive. They'll take risks more often that will be life-threatening potentially. They'll be more hostile and much more selfish and hard to get along with. A person, though, that has too much superego in this system will be over-controlled, will be overly obsessed with rules and things going a certain way, and will actually feel some guilt from even experiencing in even the most mundane types of pleasures. Any kind of pleasure might feel like you're doing something bad if your superego is overdeveloped and taking too much control over this negotiation that the id's trying to strike. The compromise the ego is trying to strike between these two influences.
Well, there's a problem because your id just wants to do bad things that it's just not allowed to do. And if you do them, you're going to get into trouble. So this tension builds. What are you going to do? Okay, so the consequence is that your ego can impose defense mechanisms. So it reduces conflict with the id or superego, and it reduces the tension. It's almost like it's trying to trick the id into doing these socially acceptable outlets for all of these inappropriate urges.
It's like striking a compromise. And there's a whole bunch of the relationships that we're talking about follow the kind of sequence. So you develop some sort of an intrapsychic conflict, and again, that might stem from childhood and might exist with a person from childhood well into adulthood. So some conflict exists between what the id wants and what the superego wants, and the ego's efforts to sort of balance out these conflicting, competitive influences on our behavior. And then this kind of conflict produces anxiety, and anxiety will persist for as long as this conflict exists deep in your unconscious. And so in order to reduce the anxiety that's produced by the conflict, then defense mechanisms become the habitual way that a person will allow an outlet for their id that wants to do bad things, but the outlet is not something that the society would punish them for. So these are a list of defense mechanisms that allow for some expression of an id's desire in a way that doesn't cause too much damage as far as the broader society is concerned. So one mechanism you can rely on is repression. So if you have some deep desire that's not appropriate, if you want to have an adulterous affair with somebody, but that's not appropriate, you can repress that urge and put it deep into the unconscious, so that you might have this, you can still have the desire, but it doesn't cause you the anxiety. It doesn't cause you to break the rules of society because you're never consciously thinking about this desire. So you keep distressing thoughts and feelings buried in the unconscious. And an example given here, a traumatized soldier doesn't recollect the details of a close brush with death. The pain that comes from recalling that experience can be avoided by this idea, repressing it into unconsciousness. But the problem is that conflict itself will potentially be manifest in other ways. A soldier that represses their pain can, for example, the idea is experience recurrent nightmares and other relivings of the trauma, even though they might repress thoughts about it during the regular, everyday, their waking hours. Not going to go through all of them, but here's another one. A reaction formation is when people will actually behave in a way that's opposite of their true feelings. So a person's deeply in love with a coworker, their boss, let's say, and it's socially inappropriate for them to date that person. They might turn that consciously into a feeling of hatred for their boss, just in order to be completely safe in protecting the ego from breaking that society's rule that you can't be in love with your boss. And here's another example. A parent might unconsciously resent a child and then respond to that by spoiling the child with outlandish gifts to kind of overcompensate for their guilt.
Okay, so according to Freud, personality develops through a series of psychosexual stages. So sexual energy takes different forms as the child matures, and at each new stage, the child has to resolve a certain amount of frustration, conflict, and anxiety. And they have to resolve these psychosexual stages in order to become a balanced, healthy adult. So the first stage is the oral stage, and this is from birth to 1 year of age. And this is when the baby's interactions with the world and access to food is largely through their mouth. So the conflict here is that it wants more. Okay, it always wants more. In this case, more oral gratification than the world can or is willing to provide. So imagine, as far as the id's concerned, it wants all the food. It doesn't want to just stop after a reasonable amount. It just wants it all. But it can't have it all, either because there's not enough, it would make it sick. So the ego has to stop and mediate between the id and superego. Now, if this conflict isn't resolved, the consequence is fixation at this stage. So you might have heard someone say, oh, they must be orally fixated. And that would normally apply to someone who overemphasizes oral gratification. So nail biting, overeating, smoking, anything that has to do with putting something into your mouth would be an oral fixation. And if you went to see a psychotherapist and you were a nail biter, they'd probably say you were fixated at the oral stage.
At least one that adopts a psychodynamic perspective.
Yes, psychodynamic.
Right? And just an example of how, from the psychodynamic perspective, it's the failure to resolve these challenges early in childhood that lead to persistent difficulties that are related to the same conflict throughout childhood and into adulthood. Mental disorder as a result of not resolving these conflicts properly in childhood. So the next stage in Freud's sequence is the anal stage, and this occurs between about 2 and 3 years old. And the key issue here is control over body function. So you've learned how to balance out your need for oral gratification as far as food goes and how much the world is willing to provide for you. Well, now a new challenge is, how do you deal with problems surrounding toilet training and society's rules over where to put your waste, right? So the conflict is the id wants no rules. The id wants to just do whatever it wants to do. It wants to live in its own filth and throw its waste around wherever it wants. Okay, so no rules surrounding cleanliness or any body functions. However, society insists on we follow certain rules in this regard, that we all use the proper facilities, etc., take enough baths to ensure our hygiene levels are high. So this is a conflict that must be resolved. If somebody doesn't resolve this, then you get fixated. You become anally fixated at this stage, or fixated at the anal stage. And on the one hand, you might ultimately develop into an adult that has a complete lack of control over their behavior, and they're messy, and they're not responsible, they're never on time, they can never get anything done, they smell bad because they're not washing themselves properly, the teeth are falling out because they can't brush their teeth enough, and they never floss. On the other hand, if you get fixated and not your id, but your superego has exerted too strong a control over this conflict, then that will result in obsessive cleanliness, right? And this is where you get the anal retentive personality, the famous term for a person who insists on everything being perfectly clean, must wash their hands 100 times a day, and can't bear this coming into contact with any germs whatsoever.
Okay, the phallic or Oedipal stage is between 4 and 5 years of age, and the key issue here is trying to gain the opposite sex parent's love and attention. But the problem is the same-sex parent is a competitor. Now, boys and girls go through this stage differently according to Freud. But for Freud, this was the most crucial stage. So for boys, he thought what happened when they were at this stage is they might see a little girl or their mom naked and see that she doesn't have a penis. What happened to her penis? Well, the idea is the dad must have cut it off because they got mad. So if you make your dad mad, he's going to cut off your penis. So if your dad finds out that you love your mom and you want to get close to your mom, he's going to get mad at you and cut off your penis. So you have to learn to repress your desire for your mom and start associating with your dad. Now, once you start associating with your dad, this is what allows your superego to emerge. Okay, it's because you repress your feelings towards your mom, associate with your dad, you now get a nice, healthy superego. Unfortunately, women, things don't go as well for us according to Freud. Our superego just isn't as strong. Because we see a penis, well, we don't have to worry about castration anxiety. We already lost our penis, so we don't have to worry about losing anything. So this means we don't need to have a strong urge to give up our Oedipal feelings, okay? So our attraction to our father. Well, because we don't have to do that, we never develop this strong superego. So we don't associate with our same-sex parent, and we don't develop this strong superego. So according to Freud, we're a little bit weaker in the morality department.
It's weird, weird stuff, everyone. Nobody can say that Freud wasn't creative.
Oh, and we always have penis envy as women because we always miss the penis we thought was taken away from us.
Well, moving on. So the failure to adequately resolve this particular conflict is seen in critical in determining whether a person is capable of forming healthy relationships as an adult. And you can be reminded of the discussion about caregiver-child attachment, the discussion we had earlier, and how important that is for developing good, healthy adult relationships. So maybe he was onto something, vaguely onto something there. Despite the weird penis envy and castration aspects of his theory.
Okay, now the latency stage is between 6 years old to puberty. Now, he called this intermission. So pretty much nothing happens by way of personality development. Your personality is pretty much formed, according to Freud, once you've resolved that Oedipal stage or the phallic stage. So the only thing you really have to do in the intermission stage is make new friends.
Okay, but between puberty and throughout puberty and into adulthood, we're going to go through the genital stage, and this is the key stage involved in developing a healthy adult sexuality. The conflict here is that the id wants sex whenever it likes and doesn't really care much for society's rules surrounding monogamy and promiscuity. However, the superego, because it understands that society has rules about how we're allowed to express our sexuality in a moral way according to society's definitions, the superego imposes constraints on this desire that the id has. This frustrates the id. A conflict ensues in which the ego has to strike some balance between these two powerful forces of the angel and the devil, right? Metaphor. The failure to resolve this conflict leads to a fixation, as with the other stages. And the result can be an overly repressed an inability to experience pleasure in having sex. Or alternatively, if the superego is more in charge and wins too powerfully in this conflict, if the id wins too powerfully in this conflict, then that will result in an overly impulsive sexuality. Somebody who has all kinds of sex partners and isn't really concerned about the moral implications of that.
So here's a chart just describing the different stages. So the first stage is the oral stage, and it's between 0 and 1. And the erotic focus for this stage would be the mouth. So it's involved in sucking, biting. The key task is weaning. So for Freud, it was from breast or bottle to no longer taking one of those. The anal stage is approximately between 2 and 3. The erotic focus is the anus, and the key task is toilet training. Stage 3 is the phallic stage, and this is between 4 and 5. The erotic focus is the genitals and masturbating. And the key task is identifying with the adult role models and coping with your Oedipal crisis. Latency is the next stage, and this is between 6 and 12, and there are no erotic focus areas in this stage. You're pretty sexually repressed, and your key task is expanding social contacts. The last stage is the genital stage. It's from puberty onward. The erotic focus are the genitals and being sexually intimate, and your key task is establishing intimate relationships and contributing to society through working.
Well, there's been some objections to psychodynamic theory, as you might well imagine. First of all, the theory of the id, superego, and ego, it's just too descriptive to be confirmed scientifically. There's just no way to measure whether he's right, that you have this id and this ego and this superego fulfilling these different roles. You can't really know one way or the other whether that's true scientifically. It's like a good story, but can't really measure it, so can't confirm it. Then the second problem is the theory was developed, the origins of the theory are a small number of clinical patients with quite unusual behavioral problems. So imagine basing your entire idea of human psychology on the most neurotic and mental disordered of the bunch of us. Sort of worry that maybe his theories may not generalize to people in general. And the third problem is the theory seeks to make sense of current behavioral problems based on descriptions of childhood events. So people would talk about these conflicts in childhood, and then Freud would reason that those conflicts caused some sort of a abnormal behavior when these people were adults. And the problem with that is that when patients in describing their childhood may well have gotten a lot of things wrong. We talked all about how remembering is error prone, and there's no reason to think that what the patients told Freud about their childhoods was actually true and actually happened just the way they described. But this assumption that the experiences that we have as adults, our tendency to be more depressed or not, our tendency to be quite anxious or comfortable and confident, the idea that that you can pin down specific events in childhood to explain outcomes in adulthood is false reasoning. And in fact, it's a known logical fallacy that philosophers have been aware of for some centuries, and it's called post hoc ergo propter hoc. That is, if some event occurred before some outcome, then the event that occurred before must have caused the outcome. So some event happened in childhood, and then later on in adulthood you had some experience. Let's say you're depressed, or you can't form decent romantic relationships. And there's this childhood earlier in your life, this childhood event, that you can somehow draw some link between those two things. Well, just because a story can be told about the relationship between those two events doesn't actually mean they're related, and doesn't mean that childhood experience had any causal effect on those later experiences a person might have in adulthood. And it's like, isn't there some obvious examples of that, right? Just because one thing happens before another thing doesn't mean the first thing caused it. So it's a fallacy that people will often make, often leading to wrong conclusions.
So another problem with Freud's theory is that it's a bit male-centered. So this idea that women have penis envy, that any of our emotional problems would stem from our dissatisfaction with being female and losing our penis, it's a little irritating. And this view was challenged by Karen Horney. She suggested instead that maybe men's problems stem from their childhood dissatisfaction with being male. They maybe have womb envy. We can actually produce children. We can create new life. Men must feel pretty jealous about that. So she's making the point that both genders can point to differences. It doesn't make one inferior to the other, because arguments could be made in both cases. But Freud's theory is quite male-centered.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Another big problem I have with Freud, at least, and many other people have the same objection, is it's such a bleak view of human nature. It assigns our two major motives to two of the most primitive drives that humans do have, the drive for sex and the drive for violence. But that seems to be all that Freud thinks that matters to humans. And most humans might well disagree with this emphasis on sex and violence, that yes, we do have violent urges sometimes, and yes, we certainly do have the drive for sex, but humans also have other drives that are other actual motivated drives that are actually in concert with what society would like us to behave like. Helping drives, altruism, that kind of thing. So the people that emphasize this perspective, that it's not all the urge for sex and violence, that we actually do have an urge to become important, helping members of a society, those are called humanistic psychologists. And what they suggest is that humans have a natural tendency toward goodness, that we're not just basically ids that want sex and violence, that no, the most powerful impetus for humans is the tendency toward goodness. They opposed vehemently the idea that unconscious urges dominate in people's psyches, and they argued that people can take control over their own behavior and their mental health by becoming more aware of themselves and what causes them to feel certain ways, and what is the actual reason why they might be behaving sometimes in maladaptive ways. So one way of looking at it from this humanist perspective was brought to us by Carl Rogers, and he's one of my favorites because he just had such a happy view of humans and our personalities and what caused us to go wrong when someone does go wrong and end up having disordered behaviors or acting maladaptively, acting in ways that are damaging to themselves or society. He suggested that the way that people behave across situations, it's not based in these unconscious urges, but it depends on their self-concept. We behave based on the way we perceive ourselves. We have certain rules that we want to live by. We have certain standards for ourselves and belief systems in us that control our behavior. And these sets of perceptions that we have about our abilities and our characteristics, that's really what guides our behavior. So in part, we all are who we think we are. And if we perceive ourselves to be honest, law-abiding, good-hearted people, then that's just who we'll be. Okay? But this isn't only up to us, unfortunately. We're all born in a context with others surrounding us, imposing their own views on how we should be.
And people really want to please others. Okay, so we're searching for this positive regard. Everyone wants to be loved unconditionally. So our self-concept can get confused with what others think of us or want us to be. So imagine a child, 18, we'll say a young adult, who's going off to university and they really want to be a musician. That's who they see themselves as. But their parents want them to be a doctor. Now, if they follow who they think they are, their own self-concept, and try and become a musician, their parents might not love them as much, or that's a fear they can have, that the worth their parents have for them, the value their parents have for them, are tied up to these conditions of worth or being what others want you to be. So our self-concept and our behavior are influenced by conditions of worth, because even though we all may want unconditional positive regard, often we just get this conditional love or conditioned positive regard.
Right, where love's contingent on us being the way people want us to be as opposed to who we are. Right? And so the difference between the truth about ourselves and our self-concept, if we start behaving in ways to get positive regard from other people, but that deviate us from who we think we are, maybe you're trying to impress people trying to impress their friends by engaging in some kind of criminal act, by like shoplifting. Teenagers might do that kind of thing. That can lead, that kind of thing. Or like Lana's parents want you to be a doctor, but you want to be a musician, and then in order to just make them happy, then you go ahead and try to train yourself as a doctor. The difference between what's true about ourselves and our self-concept, that leads to experiencing incongruence. The difference between how we are behaving and what's true about our self-concept feels very bad when it's not in sync. This incongruence causes mental disorder, according to the Rogerian approach to personality. So don't you get reminded of that topic of cognitive dissonance we talked about just a bit earlier, in which a person's beliefs and their actions may not be consistent. One might believe stealing's bad, but they might then steal, and that produces a tension in us. And this is the kind of thing that Carl Rogers was very interested in, because he thought this kind of incongruence had destructive effects on a person's psyche, and really experienced as torture, and so it could explain a lot of mentally disordered behavior.
Okay, so think back to the example I gave. Imagine yourself, you want to be a musician. That's your self-concept. But your parents want you to be a doctor. What do? Well, this top chart, if you see the self-concept and the actual experience, they overlap quite a bit. So this would be the case of when you actually chose to follow your own self-concept and try and become a musician. So now your actual experience is congruent with who you see yourself to be. So there's, as it notes here, some incongruence is probably unavoidable. We all would like to see ourselves as better than who we are, but this is a pretty good match. Now this one on the bottom, there's not a lot of overlap. So here you can imagine the student who wants to be a musician, that's how they see themselves, but instead they do what their parents want and train for medical school. So there's not a lot of overlap now between their own self-concept and their actual experience. And this would produce this incongruence that Jason mentioned. And you could imagine that the person who did this had this incongruent self-concept and experience, would be feeling a lot more distress and tension than the person who was actually, well, following their heart.
Being themselves. Okay, so just a sequence, just to kind of summarize. So a person can come to believe that the affection they receive from others is conditional on being a certain way. So that requires, one consequence of that is that a person might need to distort their shortcomings, pump themselves up to be better than they actually are, and they would do this in order to cause themselves to feel like they're worthy of affection from others. Well, this difference would result in an incongruent self-concept, because you have a self-concept that's way overestimates your abilities and pumps you up to such saintly heights that you could never possibly live up to this high self-concept that you've established. And so this produces recurrent anxiety, and then in order to reduce the anxiety, a person might engage in defensive behavior, bullying people into agreeing that they're the best person ever in order to maintain this self-concept, for example. And that would protect the inaccurate self-concept, because now you forced everybody to agree that you're perfect. And however, still, you're not perfect, and there's this incongruent self-concept that's going to generate some anxiety levels again, and you'll have to do something in order to somehow protect this concept that you have, that you're much, much better than you actually are. Think about American Idol contestants. Maybe is a good example. What do they do when they find out that they're not good enough to get onto Idol? They freak, right?
Usually call Simon names.
So that's the definitive defensive response when somebody's threatened your self-concept, that you're this brilliant singer. Maybe you are, but most of us are not. Okay, so after Carl Rogers, but well, more or less the same time, Abraham Maslow came out with a similar, more humanistic view of personality. He thought that humans were much more than just sex fiends and violent people that are bloodthirsty. So he came up with the idea that, well, he listed all the other needs that people seem to have, and that also control a person's behavior. But what he noted with people is that they seem to have to get certain more primitive needs met first before they can move on to other, let's say, more socially relevant needs, which we also have as well. It's just note that Freud didn't really think that deep down we have any socially supportive motives and drives, that we weren't particularly motivated to benefit society as a whole, that we're really just interested in sex and violence. Well, Maslow didn't agree with this. He said that people's ultimate motivation in life is to seek what he noted was self-actualization. And this is the term referring to a person reaching their own optimum potential, being the absolute best that they can be. The problem is that the world presents an obstacle to our ability to reach self-actualization, because it makes it necessary to fulfill all these other pesky and annoying needs first before you can move on to that ultimate goal. It's like the levels of a video game. You have to meet the earlier levels before you can get to the highest one, and that's not easy. And society may never give you the opportunity. So think about the layers that you have to go through in order to reach the top level of self-actualization. Okay, and you have to meet these lower ones first if you're ever going to get there. The lowest ones are physiological needs, basic survival needs, taking care of your hunger and your thirst and so forth. Not especially a concern in cultures like Canada or the United States or Europe, these are often met for us automatically, not with everybody, but with most of the people in these more advanced economies. But in more poverty-stricken countries, these needs may never get fully met by somebody that develops in parts of Africa. And as a result, they would never get beyond a concern for anything but these most basic survival needs. But if you have those taken care of, you'd move up a level, and then you'd work on safety and security needs, so more long-term survival and stability, getting a decent occupation so that you can ultimately provide for your children, for example, that kind of thing. So not just your own survival, but also providing security for a family and maybe a spouse. And then up a level, once you've got that taken care of, you'd be focused on meeting your belongingness and love needs, getting decent friendships established, close romantic relationships, intimate relationships, having a nice friendly relationship with kids. Notice that if you don't have the resources to take care of your children, you can't really focus on forming a decent relationship with them, which is why poverty actually doesn't only threaten these basic survival needs, it threatens a person's ability to meet the social needs that they have in order to have a decent, close relationship with their family members. And then up a level are esteem needs, that the broader society should think highly of you. We all have a basic motive for this, but we can't really get to it unless we've met these lower levels of needs. Up here is the cognitive needs, where when we're focused on just getting as much knowledge and understanding about the world around us as we can. The thirst for knowledge cannot proceed unless we've more or less taken care of these other lower, more basic needs. Aesthetic needs are a bit higher, so these are our desire for beautiful things and structure and order in our environment, getting some control over environment, and I guess that would lead us ultimately to this highest level of self-actualization, and that's you being the most optimally functioning person that you were born to be, being exactly who you are. So a person would be highly, highly congruent in Carl Rogers' terminology. Their self-concept and their success would be perfectly in sync, and they will have achieved as well their full potential. And it's fair to mention that Maslow didn't really think virtually anybody made it this far. He considered it quite a rare thing. People like Gandhi made it, Martin Luther King made it, self-actualization might have been achieved by people like Abraham Lincoln, maybe, or very extraordinary figures in history, but virtually nobody else will ever have the opportunity to get there. The Dalai Lama might be a good modern-day example, Nelson Mandela, people like that, heroes. Here's some of the characteristics of self-actualizing people if you're interested in. Pretty long list, but check it out. Maybe you too can one day be self-actualized. Here's a recipe.